Hey everyone. Okay, we are back. Let's continue on to chapter 13. And I'm sorry if I'm close. I'm trying to keep stuff from the. Sorry if I gotta clean my counter off. It's a mess right now. But Bible study comes first. Okay, let's continue on with chapter 13. And chapter 13 is about God's promises. God promises Abram the land again. So, the first section talks about Abram and Lot separate. This is where they separate. So we're going to start with chapter 13, verse 1 through 4. And 1 through 4 talks about how Abram returns to the land that was promised to him. And 1 through 4 says, "And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him unto the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai," which is Hai, "unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord." So in verse 3 where it says the place where his tent had been in the beginning. So even though Abram came back from Egypt with great riches, he returned to the same place as before. The place of the altar he made there at first. So at this point, Abram did what he should. He got busy doing what he needed to do, and that was living with the tent as a pilgrim and the altar as a worshiper, calling on the name of the Lord. You can also reference this to Revelation chapter 2, verse 4 and 5. You know, Abram should not have used the blessing God brought to him in Egypt as a justification for going there. Even though God is great enough to bring good even when we disobey. And there is still a cost that's built into disobedience. So, you know, Abram's unbelief took him from his place of worship, and it led him into sin, and it caused him to lead others into sin. His unbelief displayed greater confidence in his ability to lie than in the protecting power of God. It even broke apart his family for a while. Even an ungodly king rightly rebuked Abram. But here, the verses I just read, Abram came back into the promised land where he started, basically as a beginner. He came back to Bethel, back with the tent and the altar, back doing with what he should. You know, God wants the believer to walk in their first love and their first works. So, you know, that's if you really think about it, you know, when we disobey, well, actually, when you get led astray or you disobey, it leads you into sin, right? If you are not careful, it is true back then as it is true today, or it's true, sorry, I said it backwards. It's true today as it was back then. Nothing has changed. That if something leads you into sin, you're going to have followers. You're going to have, if you are not careful, you are going to drag other people into sin with your actions. And you don't want to do that. So be very, very careful and tread lightly. Okay, let's continue on to verse 5 through 7. And verse 5 through 7 is the contention between Abram and Lot's hired workers. All right, so 5 through 7 says, "And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And the land was not able to bear them, and they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. All right, so in verse 5 where it says Lot also went with Abram. So God commanded Abram to leave his family behind, and when he came to the land of Canaan, which is in Genesis chapter 12 verse 1, but Abram brought his nephew Lot along. You know, trouble like this was the result, the fighting and the strife. And in verse 6 where it says their possessions were so great. So there was a great difference between the riches of Abram and the riches of Lot. They both had great wealth, but Lot's wealth, the difference between their wealth is that Lot's wealth had possessed him. Abram had great possessions, but they did not possess him like it did Lot. And that was a big issue. And in verse 7, where there was a strife between the Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock, something had to be done about this strife, because they could not continue a conflict like this before the unbelieving inhabitants of Canaan, because that could cause a really, really, really big issue. All right, so let's continue on with verse 8 and 9. And this is Abram's generous offer to Lot. One moment, please. Okay. So 8 and 9 says, And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. So basically in verse 9 it says, Is not the whole land before you? So basically that means, since God gave all the land to Abram and not to Lot, it was pure generosity on Abram's part that caused him to make this offer to Lot. It was generosity, because he didn't have to do that. And if you take the left, I will go to the right. So he did not yield to Lot out of weakness, but out of love and trust to God, or in God. A few acres of grazing land didn't seem worth fighting for to a man who lived an eternal perspective. Abram knew that he could trust God. He did it because he learned that God would provide for his needs. Like I said, he didn't have to do that, but he did. All right. Excuse me. Got it itchy. You know, also Abram was able to fight when the occasion demanded it. And you can reference in Genesis 14, verse 14 through 16. God was glorified when Paul, out of love, surrendered his right to be supported by the gospel. And you can reference that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I can't speak this evening, verse 14 through 18. And God was glorified when Jesus, out of love, surrendered his right to an existence that knew no human suffering or trial by experience. And that you can reference in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 through 11. And also, Abram fulfilled the New Testament principle of love, where it says, let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. And that is also in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4. All right, verse 10 through 13. 10 through 13 talks about how Lot chooses his portion of land. So 10 through 13 says, And Lot lifted up his eyes, and behold, all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord like the land of Egypt, as thou comest into unto Zoar. Then, excuse me, my nose is really itchy. Ugh, allergies. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. And so in the verse 10, this verse right here is basically explains you walk by faith and not by sight. Okay? Because in verse 10, when it says like the garden of the land, or the garden of the Lord. So Lot made his choice based on what he could see with his eyes. Okay? He cared only for the material abundance of the land and cared nothing for how it would impact him and his family spiritually. Very different than Abram. Because Abram walked by faith, not by sight. Lot walked by sight and not by faith. You know, he let all of his possessions possess him. He was a material person. And in verse 12 where it says Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom. So it was only this far for now, but later Lot became a leader of this sinful city, Sodom. Vaguely, or valuing only the things that could be seen, increased his wealth temporarily, but Lot would eventually lose it all. And you can also reference that in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. All right, so, you know, also, it wasn't Lot's choice that led his heart astray, if you think about it. It was his, you know, because his heart was already astray. And this was demonstrated by his choice. So, he was already being led astray. All right, so the next section is talks about how God confirms his promise to Abram. Now that Lot and Abram separated. So on to 14 and 15, verse 14 and 15. And these two verses talks about how God promises the land to Abram and to his descendants forever. So 14 and 15 says, And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed forever. So in verse, I lost my spot. So verse 14, where it says Lot was separated from Abram. So God wanted to talk to Abram alone after Lot had left. And God also wanted to remind Abram that even though he gave some land to Lot, God still said the land belonged to Abram in verse 15. He still is upholding his promise. All right, and the next verse, verse 16, this talks about God reminds Abram of his promise to give Abram many descendants. And verse 16 says, And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. That says a lot in that one verse. That says a lot. When we can highlight where it says, make your descendants as the dust of the earth. You know, that's quite a promise to a childless man in his 70s or 80s. But yet Abram knew to walk by faith and not by sight. And so that pretty much highlights and sums up that verse. All right, the next two verses are the last two verses in chapter 13, which is 17 and 18. So these last two verses, it's about how Abram walks through the land God gave to him. Now, note, Abram moved his tent and lived in the plain of Mamre, M-A-M-R-E, in Hebron, and built an altar to the Lord there. So that's something to take note of as well. So the last two verses of the chapter says, "Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee." Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. So M-A-M-R-E. I wish Mamre? So something that's interesting. So a few things. In verse 17 where it says, "Walk through the land I give you." So God wanted Abram to walk and explore the land that God had promised him. And in verse 18 it says, "Dwelt in the plain of Mamre." So the name Mamre means vision. Hebron means communion. Abram once again walked in the Lord's vision for him and in communion with the Lord. That's pretty interesting. All right. So also, when he built the altar there to the Lord, this means that Abram built another altar whenever he went. So he lived life in constant awareness of the need for a sacrificial atonement and covering. He put God first and foremost in everything that he did. And that says a lot. As a token of Abraham's reception to the land by faith, when God wanted Abram to explore the land of promise, to walk through as if it were his, though he did not yet have any record of ownership to the land. In the same way, God wants us believers to explore a land of promise. For them, his word, where God has given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, which you can reference that in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, where he has given his people all things that pertain to life and godliness, which is also in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3. And God wants us believers to figuratively walk through this land, possessing it by faith. We have to have faith. And guys, that is it for chapter 13 in the book of Genesis. All right, so the next video will be on chapter 14. All right, thank you guys for staying and listening.